All right, hey gang, it's Joy, and today we are taking on a huge thing to women'splain. We are covering every single thing listed on the Unit 1 course and exam description of African American Studies. This unit focuses largely on a pre-colonial Africa. There are 12 different empires and kingdoms mentioned, and those make up the bulk of the unit. But we have to start with what College Board prefaces them with, which are 1, an explanation of African American studies, and 2, some background on the climate and language of Africa itself. So, what is African American studies? At the end of the Civil Rights Movement, during the Black Power movement, we see large numbers of Black students entering colleges for the first time. This is going to lead to the Black Campus Movement, where over 1,000 colleges are going to see their students protest for greater support of Black students and faculty and a greater study of Black history. It's because of this background that AP African American Studies as a course has more of a focus on art, culture, etc. than other social studies classes. And it's also why there are these essential sources that every student is required to know. Every single photograph that you should need to know for this unit should be scattered around this presentation somewhere. For 1.2, climate, maybe you could skirt through a push while only knowing that North America is where pumpkins come from and it rains there sometimes. But you're actually gonna have to know a tiny little bit about African geography for this course. The good thing is that you really only need to know the very basics. You're going to remember Africa's regions by this diagram right here. There's something in environmental science that's called a Hadley cell that picks up water from these areas that are above and below the equator and basically dumps it into the middle. That makes dry deserts to the north and south with super humid tropical rainforests that happen around the equator. Now from that, we can notice these 5 climate zones, right? 1, the Mediterranean, 2, the desert or the Sahara, 3, the semi-arid, so that's the Sahel, 4, the savanna grasslands, and 5, the tropical rainforests. The Mediterranean, if the laser pointer will go away, is the smallest group on this list, or smallest climate region. We don't really look at it as much. We're honestly focusing largely on like East Africa, West Central Africa, a little bit of South Africa. But when we look at the desert, right, probably largest geographic region when we're looking at Africa as a whole. This is where you're going to see your nomadic herders, you're going to see your cattle, sheep, goats, right? So you're going to see not a lot of huge settlements just because the agriculture, the land doesn't support it. But you are going to see something that is hugely profitable, and that is the salt trade. There's going to be a lot of salt around this northern region of Africa right here, so a lot of salt mines, and then people are going to be able to capitalize on that and monopolize that. 3, we've got the semi-arid regions, right? So these don't have the greatest land in the world for agriculture, for farming, but especially near a river, you can definitely make do. You're seeing a lot more drought-tolerant crops, even the soil's a little bit dry, and here you're going to see a lot of livestock, so again, things like cattle, sheep, goats, but you're also going to see a lot of people trading, and that's because you're located in a really convenient location here. You're between the northern salt mines and the southern gold mines. When we get to our 4th, savanna grasslands, this is where you can start to see people actually harvesting grain crops. And so you're going to see agriculture really start to spread in these regions. 5th, you've got tropical rainforests. That's your kola trees, your lambs, lots of cultivation, lots of agriculture, pretty much perfect conditions for it. And you're also going to see a lot of gold mines, in these regions and a lot of trade of gold in general. In these 2 regions, the semi-arid and the grasslands, is where you're going to see population really, really start to boom. And that's because of 3 reasons, right? Number 1 is going to be because of your proximity to water. You see things like the Niger River here and the Nile River here, and even the seas all around. The proximity to water is just going to allow not only trade later on, but it's going to allow for, agriculture to actually start. 2, in these 2, you're seeing a lot of fertile land because you actually have the warmth. Number 3 is the strategic geographic location, right? So we mentioned north with the salt mines, south with the gold trade. When you're looking at trans-Saharan or trans-African trade routes, then you're in a really convenient location where you can access both north and south away. So the other things you probably want to know about Africa's climate, right? It's got 2 oceans, Atlantic, Indian, hopefully you learned that in 2nd grade. You've got the five major rivers, we'll say. Main ones you'll probably want to know is the Niger River and the Nile River, because that's where a lot of civilization that we talk about starts popping up. And you've got these two seas that are going to be really big spots for trade, which are your Red Sea and your Mediterranean Sea. You can remember these by saying 2525, 5252, 6767, whichever one works best and whichever one you're going to remember it by. Then we get to 1-3 language. This is the last little bit of background information until we move on to the actual kingdoms and empires, right? The CED only specifies one group that you technically need to know about for language. Around 1500 BCE, we start seeing the Bantu-speaking peoples of Africa pop up, and they are super advanced. For one, they're heavily agricultural. They've cultivated bananas, yams, and grains. That means they can settle down and start to have specialization and all of that good stuff. For another, they have discovered how to ironsmith. They likely discovered this from the Nok people, who we'll touch on later in this unit, but this is going to give them a huge edge when it comes to expansion against other groups. The Bantu people start expanding, and we don't really know why. By 500 CE, most of the forager and hunter-gatherer groups of South and Central Africa had transformed into agriculturalist, ironworking, and Bantu-speaking populations. We know there was intermarriage, so there wasn't an extermination of most groups, so we know there wasn't a complete genocide, but generally, we don't know the reason that the Bantu expansion happened. It could have been farmland, famine, wars, overpopulation, disease, new ironsmithing frontiers, but what College Board wants you to know is that because of this, West Central and Southern Africa have a ton of languages that descend from Proto-Bantu. So Xhosa, Swahili, Kikongo, Zulu, those are the ones listed on your course exam description document. Now, I'm taking my drink of water. We're all still together. Now is when we're getting to the good stuff. We are starting out with our first ancient kingdoms in East Africa, which are going to be Egypt and Nubia. Nubia is a country also called Kush, or society that's in Eastern Africa. If you take a map of Africa, go as far northeast as possible, and that's where Nubia is. They geographically really have it made. They border the south end of the Nile, so the region is really great for agriculture, and there were copper deposits, ivory, and ebony all across the land. This meant that Nubia becomes a supplier in ancient times for Egypt's gold and luxury items. The issue is that Egypt just starts raiding Nubia in attempts to steal these gold and luxury items. In this fight, Nubia wins. They go on to absorb Egypt under the 25th dynasty of the Black Pharaohs, who go on to rule Egypt for about a century. Once you get into the Common Era, both societies do interesting things, like, for example, Nubia decides to convert to Christianity around the 5th century. But College Board specifies that they only need you to know these two as examples of ancient societies. So I'm guessing you're probably not going to know too much stuff after, the Common Era starts. Okay, the other East African ancient empire that College Board talks about is the Aksumite Empire. Right, crazily enough, it is also right by the water, although the most important water sources here are the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. The sea opens up access to trade. It can now trade with India, but most importantly, it can now trade with the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is, say it with me now, it's a Christian empire. Because of this, King Izana, the king at the time, decides to adopt Christianity. You can see evidence of Christianity on this primary source right here, coin. It contains both King Izana's face and 4 crosses on it. Christianity really stuck in the area, and Aksum's own writing system called Ge'ez is still the main liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So that's one example of a group that's voluntarily converting to Christianity way before we see things like the Scramble for Africa. The last ancient society in this unit is the Nok, and we are going all the way over to West Africa for this. They are around present-day Nigeria. The Nok are the people who taught the Bantu-speaking people how to ironwork, and that means their society is also using these super advanced tools. The Nok are also pretty unique in that they don't have a serious Bronze Age, they pretty much skip straight from stone into ironworking. They have better agriculture and more efficient hunting because of this, but they also settle down and create really great art. They're known for these terracotta sculptures, which might have had spiritual or ceremonial uses, but I'm guessing you're going to see a lot of these when you're looking at sources of the AP exam. Congrats! That's everything that College Board labels as ancient. We run West Africa with a knock, but we're going to knock out the rest of those with our 3 Sudanic empires. So Sudanic comes from an Arabic word which literally means land of the blacks. Not great. Sudanic empires are in Western Africa, right along the Niger River. They're prosperous for a few reasons. Number 1, river. And number 2, their convenient location right between the north and south. All 3 of them are just north enough to access the salt trade, just south enough to have their own gold mines, as we said in 1.2. They connect the Sahara, the sub-Saharan Africa. This commerce is what makes Ghana, our first Sudanic empire, so large and so prosperous. The Ghana Empire was the first of the Sudanic empires, but has no relation to modern Ghana. Modern Ghana chose that name, by the way, as a way of rejecting Western colonial names. Do not get them confused. So the trans-Saharan commerce brought North Africans traders, scholars, administrators, etc. And those people are going to introduce Islam to the Sudanic empires and spread it throughout West Africa. The presence of Islam is going to become so widespread that the leader of the second Sudanic empire, Mali, Mansa Musa is the name of the leader here. He's going to decide to convert the entire kingdom to Islam, which is going to give the nation even more allies and even more favorable trade, if that's even possible. In his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, we also call that Hajj, he drew a lot of attention from Islamic merchants and cartographers. He was able to monopolize that interest by trading them gold for their manufactured goods. Mali's wealth allowed it to do a lot of unprecedented things, like breeding or crossbreeding North African horses and purchasing steel weapons. And those let it gain more wealth and expand even larger. But Mali probably hit its peak in around 14th, 15th century of the Common Era. Then we see Songhai, which is able to capture lots of its territory. And Mali's going to start to drastically decline in power. Songhai, although it's around for technically the shortest period of time, only about 2 centuries, it was the last and the very largest Sudanic empire. But its real downfall was the Portuguese ships, which people traded through instead of using the trans-Saharan trade routes, which the Sudanic empires had previously been able to monopolize. That drained Songhai's primary source of wealth and made it weak enough to be defeated by an invasion in Morocco, which is going to come much later, around the late 16th century. This is where we get to 1.6. We've been giving a lot of overviews of empires. This wants to talk about a little bit about what life was actually about. All right, so learning was really important in early West African societies. One massive city in Mali was called Timbuktu, and it had a university and a thriving book trade. So this was attracting astronomers, mathematicians, jurists from all over Europe. You're going to see it on this map here, along with, although I really can't zoom in here, you're going to see a depiction of Mansa Musa on this map holding a gold crown in all his prestige. It was also during the Mali Empire, though, that we start to see griots. These are prestigious historians, storytellers, musicians. They're maintaining and sharing a lot of things. They're talking about history, traditions, cultural practices, births, deaths, marriages. Your griots are going to be the people who will hold on to every single one of those things and memorize them. Men and women both took on griot roles, but it was lightly gendered as a profession, and College Board wants you to know that. Women tended to tell more stories about the family or community, while men more often were telling political stories or battles. One example is the Epic of Sundayada, which told the story of the founder of the Mali Empire. That's an optional source that College Board lists. I don't think you'll be expected to know that. But once we get to back here, that covers all of the Sudanic empires. But then we need to take a moment to talk about religion. Mali was Islamic, so was Songhai, but African American studies wants us to know what the adoption of religions was like. So that leads us to 1.7. Religions like Islam in Mali and Songhai, and Christianity in Congo or Axum were often decided on by leaders like Mansa Musa. That means that despite tons of people converting, those people would pick up major religions alongside the local spiritual practices they kept. We call this religious syncretism. It's when people blend multiple faiths together, often whatever new faith they're adopting with their natural faiths or indigenous faith they already have. We'll see evidence of new African religions or existing African religions in the Americas. You see, a quarter of enslaved Africans who arrived in North America came from Muslim societies, and a quarter came from Christian societies. People will also start to form distinct regional religions even as they're moving into the Americas, like Louisiana Voodoo, which blends West African religious practices with Roman Catholicism. We'll also later see significant spiritual ceremonies practiced in preparation for major revolts that are happening in the Americas. One of the regions that was known for their religion was Congo, so I want to talk about them next. They're here in West Central Africa. Well, Congo was a nation that voluntarily decided to convert to Roman Catholicism. Because so many nobles voluntarily converted, we saw pretty widespread acceptance by the people without any foreign colonial occupation. This also creates the syncretic African Catholicism, which is here today. At first, this looked like it would hugely strengthen trade with Congo's trading partner of Portugal, and it really did. Portugal sold weapons and textiles, which were seen as luxury goods, to Congo by the bucketful, and Congo bought military supplies from Portugal in times of war or insurrection. But as Congo came to rely on Portuguese military aid, this becomes a really big problem. Portugal demanded access to enslaved people, as we reach the later centuries, in exchange for the military help. And Congo eventually reached a point where it was unable to limit the number of captives it was giving away. We saw nobles resorting to kidnapping fellow Congolese people in order to supply the slave trade. Congo eventually became the largest source of enslaved people in the transatlantic slave trade to the Americas. Larger region of West Central Africa was supplying 25% of all enslaved people. But we're also going to see this go on to influence early African American culture as it is developing. For example, Congolese tradition often includes naming children after saints or days of the week. And even when we switch languages that we're even talking in, we see these names persist on in early African American culture. So we're going back. There are two more West Central African kingdoms that College Board wants you to know, and those are Ndongo and Matamba. So we're going to knock out the rest of the West and West Central African kingdoms right now. Here we are. Ndongo is what we're going to talk about first. Ndongo and Matamba. They are both part of present-day Angola. They're traditionally enemies of Congo. Both are in around the same region, and that's the reason for the conflict behind them all the time. Queen Nzinga is going to come to power after her brother dies in the early 17th century, as you can see over here in the crossover between these two time periods. You can remember Nzinga rules Ndongo. They both start with N's. It's a time of Portuguese aggression. Nzinga starts off by trying to play nice. She offers to convert to Christianity. She's even baptized. But once it becomes clear that the Portuguese can't keep a promise, she ends up renouncing Christianity and leading one of the most prominent resistances against Portuguese expansion and the slave trade. After Portuguese occupation of Ndongo, she had to relocate to Matamba, but she kept up with guerrilla warfare. Queen Nzinga led multiple armies. She was a commander over the course of her life, and she was able to convince Portuguese enslaved people to join her by offering them sanctuary. But her legacy is a little more complicated. Nzinga had to capture and sell enslaved people from rival groups to finance her war, and she often used other enslaved people as bargaining chips when making agreements with Portugal and other nations. But her legacy here, what College Board wants you to know, is that the strength of her rule led to nearly 100 more years of female rulers in Matamba. So we are going to go back to Benin. The CED doesn't give as much background information on Queen India. That's a queen who's going to rise to prominence in Benin. Here in Western Africa, where modern Nigeria is, around where the coastline starts, curving inwards. In the late 15th century, she becomes the first queen mother, also known as Ioba, while advising her son. Like Queen Ijia, she's also going to lead armies into battle. Idia was also seen as someone with a lot of spiritual power, and she had a lot of medicinal knowledge. That's symbolized by what's probably the most famous symbol of her rule, which is the ivory mask that you can see right here. It has these two slits on the forehead, which are said to be filled with medicine, and they're said to be a source of her metaphysical power. This mask is probably one of the most famous symbols in all of African art. A replica of it was adopted as the symbol for Festac in 1997. That stands for the Second World Black Festival of Arts and Culture. And at the time, it was the largest Pan-African gathering to ever take place. Because these are two powerful female leaders, and these are the examples that were given of female leadership in a pre-colonial Africa or colonial, I would not be surprised if you actually compare and contrast them at some point. So we are going on to explanations 1.10 of kinship and political leadership. We've covered the political leadership part, but let's talk about kinship right now. So many West and West African societies operate through what's called the kinship group. Right, so those are relationships based on blood, marriage, or other bonds. This is a group of people who are connected by those connections. If your society took on enslaved people, they would be a part of your kinship group. These groups would often form alliances with one another, and this was the basis of much of politics. When we go on to women, right, the status of women wildly depended on your place within the continent. In some places, there were matrilineal societies. In many, women and men are going to have dual roles. Women could be spiritual leaders, political advisors, market traders, educators, agriculturalists, etc. It's generally accepted, though, that the high levels of gender inequality that we see in some parts of Africa today was, more than anything, a result of colonialism. When we move on, we are on our very last two empires here, the final stretch. We are going to talk about trade between Zimbabwe and the Swahili city-states. The Swahili coast is what we call the city-states that stretch from modern Somalia all the way to Mozambique. So this right here. It was named after Swahili, which is the Arabic word for coast. So it's kind of a chai tea or non-bread situation with the name. Pretty much all the city-states had the lingua franca of Swahili and the religion of Islam, which meant that trade was made very efficient. Their direct access to the Indian Ocean also meant that they were able to trade all over, whether with Arab, Persian, India, or Chinese trading communities. With power, though, comes a lot of rivals, and the Portuguese were able to invade this region and establish their own settlements in the 16th century, which is where we're going to see a lot of their downfall. Now, if we move on to Zimbabwe right here, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe is home to the Shona people, written right here. They become wealthy off their resources like gold, ivory, and cattle, which they were able to trade. Even though Zimbabwe is both technically landlocked, it's right here where this orange dot is, and located in South Africa, it is not far from the Swahili city-states, which meant it was able to get rich pretty fast. The wealth that was amassing through things like trading meant that it was able to create some pretty crazy architecture. The photos on screen you see right now, those are photos of Great Zimbabwe, which is the kingdom's capital, that is. The Great Enclosure was this big religious and administrative site. You could also see right here a conical structure, which historians are pretty sure once functioned as a granary. It would have held cereal grains. So we have officially, as of this point, hit all 12 of College Board's empires and kingdoms from pre-colonial Africa. Now, we are on the very last stretch, 1.11. All they want us to do is clear some other things up. So before African people were having frequent exchanges with Europe, well, they were having frequent exchanges with Europe way before the scribble for Africa. Elites were often traveling for diplomatic, educational, or religious reasons to do elite things, but there were also non-elites who would secure jobs in European port cities. We have domestic laboring, boating, guarding, entertaining, vending, becoming knights. All of these are jobs that either enslaved or non-enslaved people could do. Now we have to move on and talk about slavery. Okay. Sometimes people will try to say, oh, slavery was all over Africa. Oh my god, they enslaved people way before the Europeans. People try to say this as a way to explain away the transatlantic slave trade. Those people are misinformed or they're stupid. We're going to talk about the facts. Some West African societies did include enslaved people. This was a lot more similar to the European serf system than American chattel slavery. People could become enslaved because of debts, court orders, or war. Then they would perform tasks like farming or domestic labor within their assigned kinship groups. The difference here is that enslaved people were not objects. You weren't enslaved because of your skin color or how long a pencil would stick in your hair or because your grandfather was enslaved. Enslavement wasn't hereditary and often wasn't even permanent. Enslaved people were probably seen as the poorest people within a kinship group, but at the end of the day, they were still considered people, not to be actually owned as physical property by other people. Here's the shift College Board wants you to know, that it was around the mid-15th century in which the Portuguese first colonized Cabo Verde and Sao Tome. Those are what College Board considers to be models for chattel slavery, and they created the kind of plantation agriculture that would come to dominate the Americas. So that brings us to an end. We're clocking in under 30 minutes, I see. This is the part where I leave you guys. There is an official FRQ on this slide. This is from 2025, and this is going to talk about 3 of our West African empires here. I'll link a scoring guide in the description if I can find it. Besides that, I am going to pass out. Stay up, stay woke, stay educated. I am out of here.